All right. How are we doing today?
We're good.
Good morning. My name is Jeremy Slavitz. For those of you who do not know me, I am a local historian. I've been working in history on Nantucket for 25 years. I'm the former Director of Programs and Education for the Nantucket Lifesaving Museum, the former curator for the Nantucket Lifesaving Museum, and since my departure from the Lifesaving Museum, what I've been doing is freelance consulting work, working with museums in the region, around the country, a few international clients. But most importantly, due to my experience with the Nantucket Lifesaving Museum, I've been working with the Coast Guard Heritage Museum over on the Cape. So I have a real love and passion for the history of the United States Coast Guard. And when I was given the opportunity to come and speak here at the museum, I was able to really just sort of through luck come up with a topic that talks about an island icon. Does anyone remember this? Yes, the lightship down on Strait Wharf. The lightship was there for a roughly 10-year period. And this is the story of how the lightship came to Nantucket. And before I get started, I'd like to thank all the different pieces of the puzzle, all the different organizations that helped this out. The first is the Nantucket Anglers Club, which I'm going to get into why in a moment. Second is the Nantucket Athenaeum, who keeps the Inquirer and Mirror archive, which is a great research tool for local history. And also the Nantucket Historical Association for the use of their photos. So what we're going to do today is talk about how a found item can lead to a story that I was unaware of and I don't think a lot of other people are aware of. And this is the story of how the lightship comes to Strait Wharf. And it begins right here. This is a photo album, of course, it says photos right on it. During the winter, last winter, I was doing some work as a volunteer up at the Nantucket Anglers Club as part of their 100th anniversary. And one of the things that they wanted to do was sort of sort out and scan and put on display the photos of the club during its 50-year history. So what this meant is that I'd go in the evening and basically go through these cardboard boxes full of photographs, full of old photo albums, find ones and find what was in there, scan them, digitize them, and then get them out. So we were actually showing them in the club. Well, as I was going along, I finished one photo album and I pulled this one out of the bin, thinking it was just more pictures of people talking about the great fish that they had caught or at their Halloween party.
All the first prize winners.
Yeah, but what was interesting, as soon as I opened up, I found this. And I'd always heard that the lightship was brought back to Nantucket Island by a crew of volunteers. But in my travels, I had never really seen any images of that event. I'd seen images of the lightship there, and I had heard the stories about, a group of local individuals who had gone and crewed the ship back to Nantucket. And I found this, and I was like, oh boy, look what I found. A story that's right in my wheelhouse with Coast Guard history, a great Nantucket story. And here are these photos that have been sitting in this cardboard box since the 1970s. And on the back of these photos, it said July 1975. So I'm like, wow, this is great. And it's got pictures of people I know or know of. And it shows something that you usually don't see, the crew volunteering and sailing this vessel back to Nantucket Island. So I started to dig in deeper. And this is where the first step is. I went to the Inquirer and Mirror archives and started to do a search. But I want to actually start our story with a little bit, for those of you who are not familiar with the lightships themselves. The Nantucket Lightship, which is, many people believe this is where the art of lightship baskets began, was actually the Salt Shoals Lightship, right here. Okay, we always say the Nantucket Lightship or the Boston Lightship or the Columbia Lightship. It's important to realize that with these vessels, that's not the actual name of the vessel. Lightships are known by their number, okay? The lightship that was here at Nantucket Island was Lightship 112. We'll get into that in a little bit. And these lightships moved around. For example, multiple ships served on that station. They were moved about For example, the last lightship to serve on that station, which served from 75 until 1983, actually began its life serving off the coast of San Francisco. So when you see the side of a lightship, recognize that that's more of a street sign. And this lightship was there to basically mark the entrance to the Nantucket Ambrose shipping lane, basically the main east-west approach into New York City. Have you been to South Street Seaport down in New York? Mm-hmm. Okay, Ambrose Lightship is right there. So that's served at this end. And basically what this is these imaginary lines drawn on the ocean, basically a divided highway. Ships would come in on the right-hand side inbound, on the left-hand side outbound, making their way back and forth. There's basically highway signs, and this was designed to control this traffic. And our story of the lightship that comes to Nantucket actually begins with the prior lightship. It's this vessel right here, Light Vessel 117. It was built in 1931 and served on station until 1934. And this is a famous lightship in its own right. Many of you may know the story of this lightship. This lightship illustrates the dangers of being on a lightship. Oftentimes, particularly when we talk about lightship baskets, we talk about how there's a lot of downtime, which allowed the crew on board these ships to really work on the art of lightship baskets. It's where that art developed. But service on board a lightship was actually not only, in some cases, very dismal. I work with a lot of former lightship sailors at the museum over on the Cape, and one of the biggest the issues that these guys have, now that they've gotten older, is they're hard of hearing, because that bell and that foghorn going on continuously. Okay, but the thing is this was dangerous on these heavily trafficked shipping lanes. This right here is the liner Olympic in January of 1934. Okay, this is a close pass by Olympic. A month later, she'd be sideswiped by the vessel Washington. And liner Olympic here, 4 months after this photo was taken, this occurs. Lightship 117 was run down by the liner Olympic. For those of you who do not know, the liner Olympic was the sister ship to the Titanic.
Right.
She was massive. This lightship was only about 100 feet on the deck. She was run down, killing all but 2 crew members. So this shows the danger of serving on board these lightships. This was hazardous duty. Basically what she was doing is she was following a radio beacon, basically following that radio beacon in, and of course to save time, they cut it as close as they can, set their course, run down the shipping lane. This in thick fog, this is actually not an accurate representation. It was foggy, so they should have just painted this all gray. But this shows the danger of being on board the lightship. But with the lightship being run down by the Olympic, what ends up happening is that the British government pays to replace it. And this brings us the lightship we know, the Lightship 112. Here she is underway. Of course, I didn't stay out there all the time. The other thing is oftentimes you'll see a lightship called Relief. Okay, that was a lightship that basically its job was to move from point to point to point. Allow these vessels to come offline, sit in dry dock for a while, have repairs done, and come back. So this is Lightship 112, and in many ways, this is sort of the iconic Nantucket Lightship. But I find this fascinating too, because this is also a lightship that not a lot of people saw. Okay, as you can see from my previous slide, I mean, she's 50 miles off the beach. There's no ferry that runs close by to her. Had we were coming on a cruise we were cruising an ocean liner from Europe, yes, you'd see the Nantucket Lightship, but the most commonly seen lightship for those visiting Nantucket or those who lived on Nantucket traveling to the Cape would have been the Crossrope Lightship right in the middle of Nantucket Sound. So she was built by the British government, and she served on that station from 1936 until 1975. This Nantucket Lightship, this is where a lot of the lightship sailors that we know who served on this lightship, this is the vessel that they served on. Okay, this is where some of these guys produced lightship baskets. However, from some of the gentlemen I talked to, that art seems to have faded away on board the lightship ships. I learned less in talking to one of the guys who served on board the Nantucket Lightship. To be honest, I learned less about how to make lightship baskets and more about how to ferment the juice ration. So I think it's a different museum for that. But and here she is, high seas, Make way. Yeah, this in many ways is the iconic shot. She was designed to be as indestructible as possible. Double hulled. These things were often locked up in ice. Of course, they were designed to stay on station regardless of weather. So they were basically fixed, anchored at 4 points. So they're a fixed point on the ocean. These guys are just basically a floating lighthouse. But it gives you an idea of what the vessel looked like on some pretty decent seas. Now, this is also a vessel where this vessel does connect to Nantucket, and this is part of why I believe I found this material in the Angler's Cub collection. During the 1950s and 1960s, there was a significant offshore sport fishery and commercial fishery for swordfish and marlin. And the Lightship was one of those sort of landmarks that was out there. It's one of the areas where they would use to fish. So a lot of the people who went out on various sport fishing boats would have seen them. In fact, when I was a kid, I saw the last Lightship there on station when we were out there fishing, going and chasing around those fish. But what happens in 1975? By 1975, the utility of lightships has really disappeared. They can be manned lightships can be replaced by automated buoys. And this starts to occur up and down the East Coast. And by the 1970s, Nantucket Lightship is one of very few lightships in the country, let alone the East Coast. And in digging through the Inquiring Mirror and trying to learn about this, I started out in 1975, and I found this piece from Charlie Sale's Waterfront News. This used to be a regular column in the Inquiring Mirror. And there are two pieces that sort of intro our story here. The first is January 30th, 1975. 2 more lightships on the East Coast, the Boston and the Portland, are going to be replaced by buoys. And this leaves Nantucket as the singular lightship on the coast. Okay? There are some still left on the West Coast, the Great Lakes, but those 2 ships are taken off. And then shortly after that, by March 21st, Nantucket is taken off. This is also very interesting because even though he says there's going to be a large buoy that's going to be placed there, the lightship that he mentions on the West Coast is the San Francisco Lightship, which would come back and then sit on Nantucket Station until the end of until the Lightship Station was completely discontinued. So these lightships are taken offline. And once Nantucket Lightship is taken offline, there seems to be a push to get the lightship for Nantucket. And it's led by this guy. Okay, this is Bob Caldwell. This is a later photo. I used to work at the Lifesaving Museum, which was started by Bob Caldwell. It's one of my favorite photos. Particularly, this was the photo we always had in the lobby. Not so much for the visitors, for us. For when it was things like coming in on the weekend because the toilet was clogged. This always made us feel better. But we at least knew that Bob Caldwell was looking down on us and rooting for us to do a good job. Well, Bob Caldwell reaches out to the US government and attempts to get the lightship as a form of salvage. Only a few years before, 1969, he had opened up the Nantucket Lifesaving Museum down in Pulpus. And as a Coast Guard historian, he saw this as a part of the story. So he is the one who appears to have made the first push. And it was going to be contingent, of course, on being financing, which I love how they italicize in this. Get that message out. We're going to need the money on this. And bring the ship to Nantucket. But it doesn't seem to work out. I think that after looking at the vessel in dry dock, of course, when she was taken offline, it's not like she had gotten right out of dry dock. She was basically coming in to be replaced. She was pretty tired. She was in pretty bad shape, just normal wear and tear. And I think he realized that this was a little bit more than he could personally bite off. And that leads him to start talking to this guy right here. This is Roy True. Roy True was the director of the Nantucket Historical Association in the 1970s. And he picks up the ball from Bob Caldwell. And this becomes the Nantucket Historical Association's desire to bring the lightship to Nantucket Island. He starts working with the Board of Selectmen, trying to find a place for it. They actually start negotiating that the town will be the ones who acquire the lightship. Basically, they're going to try to get the lightship given to Nantucket, and then the town will then give the lightship to the Historical Association. In a lot of ways, this is very similar to what occurred with the Sanctuary Light.
Yeah.
If many of you remember that, where it would be the town. So the town would be acting as a pass-through. But the other thing is, where would they be able to put this lightship once it was here? So what they do is they start proposing that they are going to put it somewhere down on the waterfront. And they have a bold plan. I think this is the plan. And for those of you who remember the Historical Association at this time, the Historical Association was a very small organization, still very much a volunteer-run organization. And this is the plan that they produced. They're going to put it right down on the waterfront. They're going to preserve the lightship as a historic vessel. They're going to have it open to the public. They're going to develop exhibits, have programs, and they're going to have somebody live on it and maintain the vessel. And this is their bold plan, along with the Board of Selectmen getting on board with this, to bring this lightship to Nantucket Island. And the community, for the most part, seems to be getting to it. In fact, in order to do this, the town actually has to, this sudden expenditure of money, they actually have to create it's a warrant on the special town meeting that's going to allow the town to lease this out to the Historical Association at a token price, and of course find a place for this lightship to go. But I also like where we see the reporting. The first is there's a hiccup, which I'm going to talk about, but I also found this letter really fascinating. I've excerpted it here, but of course the letter to the editors, where everybody voices their displeasure about anything going on Nantucket Island. What we have is this really interesting piece, which another vessel was actually being sold off as salvage at that time, the Nobska.
Ferry.
Yeah, the ferry. And the Nobska, and this person writes this piece saying that the Nobska is a far more valid vessel to have on the town's waterfront. It makes the case that the lightship is way out there in the middle of the ocean. People haven't really seen it. It's not really a Nantucket vessel, or does not have the ties to the island that the Nobska does, and has their role in trying to preserve the Nobska as a historic ship down here on the island. And as a side note, the Nobska, they did attempt to do that. It went through a number of different owners, much like the Lightship, until she was broken up in the 1990s. But they actually tried to preserve and save the Nobska for as long as possible, some mainland interests. So we have that, but then still not a reality for the island. The town had gone through this. They had held their town meeting. They had got approval from the Board of Selectmen. They had tentative locations, one on Steamboat Wharf, another one on Strait Wharf. Everything looked really great, except there's a third lightship in our story. And this is really where we start to tie into our diary a little bit. This is the Boston Lightship. Remember I told you this was taken offline a couple months before? Well, it turns out that these surplus vessels, basically people were in line for some of these vessels. A group in Atlantic City, New Jersey, had already gotten in line for the Nantucket Lightship. And the federal government instead offered the Boston Lightship to Nantucket. And this was not gonna go because the Boston had no connection to Nantucket Island. So this led to legal wrangling through the months of May, June, and July, in which the town of Nantucket was going to set up a trade. They would take the Nantucket Lightship, and the group in Atlantic City would take the Boston Lightship. But there was another hitch. Atlantic City did not want to pay to have the Boston delivered. And this is where our diary comes into place. As a means to do this, a group of volunteers, a massive group, but what amounted to a group, they called themselves the Dirty Dozen. This was a group of which I can identify 8 of the crew members, but there's the crew members themselves, people like Thomas Eldridge, Arthur Grant, Kenny Holgate Sr., Anthony Daca, Roy Stewart, Kenny Holgate Sr., Richard Mack, who I believe many of you know. He still works at the Nantucket Life-Saving Museum. Denny Dias Jr., okay, Robert Allen, these guys would serve as the crew that would deliver the Boston Lightship to Atlantic City and then deliver Nantucket Lightship to Nantucket. But this crew also included people, other people like Michael Todd, I gotta remember the names, Arthur Hardy, Dan Resendiz. All these people were coming together where they would come in and literally get this ship up and running. Basically, the Boston was cold. She still had fuel in the tanks, but she had to be powered up. She had to be brought back into working order in a few days and ready to make sail. This was done by this group of volunteers. Air New England flew them up to Boston, got them on board the ship. These guys, many of them who had worked on board vessels, for example, Dick Mack, who was very familiar with the Lightships, having served on them, got this vessel up and running and took it to Boston. And this is the July 1975 photo album showing, and I'm still working on trying to figure out, this is Mr. Grant right here. There's Dick, this I believe is Dick Mack. This piece here, and this is what I love about this. What I love about this is this research has really uncovered this sort of lost aspect of the story, showing these individuals sailing not the Nantucket Lightship, but the Boston Lightship on its cruise. They left Nantucket, they brought her through the Cape Cod Canal, which I'm actually pretty impressed by. Has anyone actually gone through the Cape Cod Canal on a boat? It is a stunning tide. And this thing does not exactly look like it performs very well. They brought this through. They claimed that they had 20 feet of clearance between the top of the mast and the Sagamore Bridge, bringing it down. And in this case, there was actually some drama. And here are some other photos. I believe this is Kenny Holgate. Some of you may actually, this is Denny Dias right here. This gentleman I haven't been able to identify. Just a little bit outside my scope, but it seems that they had themselves a pretty good time,
It's a beer.
I know.
Chase Lounge over there.
I do notice the beer, but they seem to be they seem to have had a really good time. And for those of you who are interested, this is actually written up in the Enquirer and Mirror. They kept a ship's log, and it's a little bit tongue in cheek, but talks about what each person did on board the ship, who was cooking, who was moving on, talks about what they were doing to actually keep this vessel running. I mean, some of these components were the compressors and things like that. They had men down in the machine who were basically below decks the entire time, literally trying to hold portions of this ship's power plant together with baling wire and tape. So making their way. And it also leads to this. They were actually struck in heavy fog by a Liberian tanker south of Block Island. The vessel was heavily damaged. She was damaged. They had to put into Point Judith, and there, working with the Coast Guard, bring them under tow, bring them back to Point Judith, put them up alongside, and then these guys went and repaired the damage. Internal components were damaged as well. So basically had to repair this on the fly. And you have to remember, many of these guys were not people who, granted some were on board lightships, but were suddenly doing this sort of heavy machine work to get this vessel back up and running and finally bringing it back into Atlantic City, then flying back to Nantucket, and then preparing to bring Lightship 112 to Nantucket. But it didn't quite go that smoothly. Initially, they thought that middle August, the Lightship would arrive. But turns out that there was no place to put it. The town kept negotiating. The plan was to have the Lightship where it was seen today, but that area in front of where the High Line comes in, kind of where the launch is now, had to be dredged out. They had to permit that. They then had to get not only the permits, but get the work done. Additional work had to be done on the Lightship. It wouldn't be until the end of November, the first week of December, that this same crew would travel back. So the gentleman we just saw in the photos would travel back to Boston, get this lightship ready to sail, and then bring her back. Now, in this case, they did not come through the canal. What they did is they sailed out around Provincetown, off of Truro, coming back. And as you read the newspaper of that, you see accounts of, people looking out for her, seeing the lightship coming towards Great Point from a house in Shimo, having it come in. So here we have on December 7, 1975, the Nantucket Lightship coming into Nantucket Harbor. And then she was laid up on Steamboat Wharf. So this was her original home at the Steamboat Wharf Terminal. Of course, the Steamboat Wharf Terminal looks nothing like this today. She was put in that space. It was not an ideal space, as this photograph shows us. She's basically sitting on the bottom. The lightship draws 13 feet of water, and this is low tide. She's sitting on the bottom. This was why things needed to be dredged out. So then the permitting begins. The lightship is waiting for its new home. They're still working on her, and it takes better part of a year. They will dredge that out. They will make space for it. It takes time to get that going. In fact, there's almost a desperate plea in the newspaper at the beginning of the summer, in May, where the lightship needs a home. And, the Steamship Authority is getting less and less enamored with the rent that they are getting and the lack of use of their own dock. Where can that lightship go? But here it is on August 13th, 1976. The lightship would be pulled down into the space where it would sit. Now,
Excuse me, Jeremy?
yes.
So, was the Nobska then gone at that point, because that was where the Nobska was?
The Nobska was gone, yes. The negotiation for this was really between the town, Sherburne Associates, which was the owner of Strait Wharf, of course, the town conservation group rubber stamped the dredging. They're like, no problem. The state held up that dredging. And then, of course, once that was done, they had to not only dredge, but reconstruct a portion of the bulkhead, because as they dredged that out, they needed to drive pilings and drive the bulkhead down deeper into the mud in the bottom, but giving this lightship a place to stay. But it is here that she would sit. Going back to our first photo, it is here that she would sit from 1976 until the mid-1980s. The lightship, and it's interesting to say that, this was, in many ways, much like I think Bob Caldwell realized, but I don't think he realized the scope of what this would be. The lightship became an iconic fixture of downtown. This is one of my favorite shots because it's sort of that classic coming in on the ferry shot, looking back up at the clock tower. It was the thing that people saw, whether they were coming on the High Line, whether they were coming in on the steamship. This was Nantucket. And, if you remember, it was on, every postcard shot of town had the Nantucket Lightship. It was seen as that iconic space. But unfortunately, and you can actually start to see the cracks, even in 1976, is what it would actually take to maintain this as a historic vessel. Now, the Historical Association did a lot of good stuff with this. I mean, in the late 1970s, this is where the Boy Scouts met. This is where the Boy Scouts had their meetings. They had interns living on it. They did actually, starting in 1976, they actually rented the berths. And there are actually some people who are still on the island who their first time out to Nantucket, literally came out to Nantucket as college students, lived on board the Lightship for a season, renting it from the Nantucket Historical Association. But the vessel itself just became too much to maintain. As she filled in, as the dredging filled in around her, basically she was sitting on the mud again, which started to really be detrimental to her hull. There's only so much that you could take and peel off paint and things like that. These are massive projects. A good example of this, sort of in comparison, in the 2000s, the Lightship Overfalls was in much the same situation, and they brought her back to a floating condition. Not including the pier that they had to build and the berth that they had to build for her. It cost them $15 million to just put her into dry dock. This was unfortunately, it was a very cool thing for the Historical Association to have. It was not it was really just drawing money down that they did not have, the ongoing maintenance. And in the 1980s, the Lightship would depart Nantucket Island. It did have one sort of bright shining moment during the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty. The Nantucket Lightship, actually with some of the individuals who sailed her to Nantucket, was in New York Harbor during that fireworks display. But the Lightship basically made her way to Boston. She actually made it down into the mid-Atlantic, but she basically languished. And in the 2000s, she was actually to the point where she was put up at auction. And there was another move to bring the Lightship back. And this time the Historical Association looked at their history and said, probably not. But the idea, and basically she was going to be sold off for scrap. Gentleman named Mike Manio bought her. Lightship 112 has been bought, and she is in Boston right now. And, excuse me. She is currently being slowly restored. This group in Boston has been taking care of her, getting her dry dock time, slowly bringing her back. So this is a vessel that looks like it will probably be saved, even though it is no longer here on Nantucket Island. But what I like about this story was this story really illustrates what we can do not only with local history, but with our own history. When I initially found that photo album, I thought, wow, this is really cool. This is the Nantucket Lightship, and stuff that no one had ever seen. But through the research projects, through going through and starting to look at what the dates on those photographs were and how they combined with the actual photo album, actually shows this sort of really neat hidden part of Nantucket's past. That the crew that brought the Nantucket Lightship here to Nantucket Island didn't just bring one ship to one location. They brought two ships to two different locations. And it really shows the effort that the community made to bring this vessel here, even though it was for sort of a brief shining period of time, bring the Lightship here to Nantucket Island. Does anyone have any questions? Yes?
What is this group that has it now?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a different group that had made it into condos?
Okay, that's another Lightship. That's a different Lightship.
Oh.
Okay, that's Lightship hull number, was it 363? 612, yeah.
Okay, was it
Golden.
That, yeah, well, yeah, but remember what I told you, that it's the hull number that is the Lightship.
Okay.
What is painted on the side is where it is stationed. And there are lots of Nantucket Lightships sort of floating about.
That was my question.
There's three right now.
Yeah, there's the one in Wareham I know about as well.
Because there's been a Nantucket Lightship out in the harbor
Yes,
for a couple of years.
but that is not this hull.
112.
That's right.
What is the group who's developing it, restoring it now, what is its intended use?
Okay, they are intending to preserve. This is actually a National Historic Landmark. Their intention is that it will be preserved and be used for educational purposes, telling that story. This is part of a wider push of Coast Guard and life-saving history throughout the United States. Of all of the service branches, The only service branch in the United States that does not have a national museum is the United States Coast Guard. And what this has led to are numerous organizations scattered throughout the country who are in their own way preserving small portions of this. This group is preserving the Nantucket Lightship and that Lightship sailor story. So what they're doing, and all these groups really network well. So for example, at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum, we're putting him in touch with some of the people as part of our group who served on board lightships, who are providing both oral history, but also technical assistance. This is how this used to work. This is how we fixed it. This is how it should work. So all of these different groups are providing each other mutual support along those lines. And then of course there are lightships that are preserved at multiple different locations.
So where is 112?
She's in Boston,
She's in Boston.
yes,
So,
as is 612. And there's another one in Wareham.
okay, a couple of years ago, I was staying at a friend's apartment in America.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked out my bedroom window one morning, and there, docked, adjacent to the West Side Highway,
Yeah,
was one of these ships that said Nantucket.
yes.
Which one was it?
That is probably,
612.
yeah, that's probably 612. This 112 is very much tied to the pier.
Okay.
612 is the only lightship that can move under its own power, and it generally runs between New York and Boston, and sometimes stops at Harbor.
Okay.
Mhm.
So it was 612 I saw.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
That was my question.
Yep. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all very much. I hope you enjoyed this, and I can answer any other questions later on if people are shy.